No one knows the exact number because no one is sure how many of the early saints really existed. St. George, slayer of dragons, was removed from the official calendar when the church determined he was probably a mythical character. The same thing happened to St. Christopher, patron saint of travelers. But most saints were real people, like we are. Like us, they had their own demons to fight. And their stories give us hope, because they usually won those battles.
We've got models for all kinds of things. How to be a good journalist, how to be a good athlete. I think it's very important that people see that real human beings, not angels, not nice stories, real human beings could, through the grace of God, reach a level of holiness sufficient to be called a saint, and we could all aspire to do it.
It shouldn't surprise us that most of the men and women who become saints have been members of the clergy. But just because you're a monk or a nun doesn't mean you can't stand out. It is early in the 4th century AD. The Christian persecutions have ended. The age of martyrdom is over. And the first Christian hermits have arrived in the desert. Each has come alone to do one thing: renounce the pleasures of the body for the pleasures of the spirit. It's a struggle that will obsess many a Christian, and they'll do almost anything in their desire to get closer to God. Anthony of Egypt was one of them. Renunciation, Anthony once said, means giving up the ties of this earthly and temporal life. Only when a man is free of all human care can he turn his soul to heavenly things.
The ascetic tradition is not peculiar to Christianity. Every major religion in the world has a kind of an ascetic tradition within it.
The whole idea of asceticism was to deny pleasure, deny really even one's contact with the material world in this life, thereby increasing one's spirituality, getting closer to God somehow, aiming ultimately for glorious and eternal life beyond.
Anthony was 20 years old when he first began devoting himself to a life of poverty and prayer. He lived in the desert alone for 3 years. The Greek word for alone is monos, the origin of the word monk. Anthony was one of the first Christian monks. Like the Jesus whose life he sought to imitate, Anthony was put to the test. His many temptations and trials of the flesh have been chronicled by artists ever since. Anthony once said about his experience, "Solitude in the desert delivers a man from 3 conflicts: hearing, speech, and sight. There is only one conflict left for him, and that is with fornication." Over the years, Anthony attracted increasing numbers of disciples who settled nearby. This was true of many desert hermits. People came to see them and seek their advice.
People would come to a particular monk, a particular ascetic, and say, "Father, give me a good word." And then the monk would sort of give that person a piece of advice or tell them something that they needed to know.
So they were
looking at new ways of living out the Christian message, new ways of forming a Christian community. And so they placed a great deal of emphasis on not only on asceticism, on self-denial, but also on virtues such as patience and humility, and all the things that Christians valued in their communal living.
By the time Anthony was in his 60s, he had attracted so many admirers that the solitary life he preferred was no longer easy to come by.
And so he went off into the hills and founded the first, what we now consider the first sort of Christian monastery in Egypt in the mid-4th century AD. And each monk lived in a cell by themselves, and yet they formed a kind of a loose community. And it was Anthony who first wrote a rule for their lives.
Despite his strict asceticism, Anthony was said to be a man of much personal warmth and was not considered a fanatic. In the end, he returned, with pleasure, to the reclusive life. He would live to be 105 years old, and when he died, would be buried, according to his wishes, in a secret place.
I'm sure that if we were to meet a Desert Father, we might well think there was an element of fanaticism about him, maybe about a lot of them. Possibly some of them were suffering from delusions or diseases like schizophrenia of various kinds. But I think that when one looks at the Desert Fathers as a whole, the prevailing impression one gets is one of wisdom and moderation. The Desert Fathers were very wise teachers. They understood a lot about what it is to be a human being.
Anthony was never formally canonized. As with many of Christianity's early holy men, the people who admired him simply declared him a saint, and his legend grew. Anthony would be followed by people whose methods of liberating the spirit were even more extreme. Perhaps the most remarkable was Simeon Stylites. Each new ritual of self-mortification this holy man practiced was more bizarre than the last. Simeon once went the 40 days of Lent without food or water, and though he was unconscious by the end of it, he was eventually brought around with the Eucharist wafer and a few lettuce leaves. When none of his physical trials seemed sufficiently arduous, Simeon Stylites began the practice that made him famous.
Simeon Stylites, a fellow who, in the beginning of the 5th century AD, started out life as a holy man, living in a pit for a while, actually, and then gradually deciding that he started with living on top of a pillar that was fairly short, 4 or 5 feet kind of thing, and living on top of that. And gradually over the years, he increased the height of the pillar such that by the end of his career, if one can call it a career, he was living on a pillar that stood some 60 feet in the air.
Well, it was a little bit peculiar. He started off, first of all, sort of by sort of living in this one little area, and then he began to sort of elevate the area up until he was basically, there was a pillar and then a flat area, and he lived on top of this for some 35 or 40 years. This is not fiction. This is true. He actually lived there.
Simeon eventually, of course, living on top of a pillar for 30-some-odd years, was exposed to all kinds of weather conditions, rain and what have you, and eventually his skin simply could not take that anymore, such that he developed sores all over his body, and in those sores, of course, flies buzzing around him constantly. It's not like he did his laundry every day. The flies eventually laid eggs in his wounds, and he developed maggots in them. He saw this, in fact, as a wonderful way to further mortify his flesh, to increase his suffering in imitation of Christ. He had hired a fellow to climb up a ladder every day and bring him his daily bread and whatnot, and so he then asked asked, once the maggots developed in his wounds, when they would fall out of these sores, he asked his helper to pick up the worms and place them back in his wounds, saying to the worms as the helper did this, "Eat, worms, what God has given you." This is a strange way to live one's life.
Simeon preached from his platform twice a day to pagans, Christians, and even a few emperors.
People came from many miles around to seek his advice because they thought, gee, a guy like Simeon, he must be an incredibly holy man. He has given up all of the worldly pleasures of life and devoted himself to God in this manner, and so he must be in touch with God. He must be able to tell us what God wants us to know. So people would congregate, and every day he would preach to them. He would receive questions and give answers, much as a psychic might do today.
His preaching, they say, was practical and kindly, aimed at encouraging sincerity and justice and discouraging swearing. Simeon died on his pillar, bowed in prayer, when he was 69 years old. Like Anthony, he was named a saint by his local community, which probably had no idea why he had chosen to live 60 feet above the ground.
It is difficult to know what Simeon himself thought he was doing. I would imagine that if you had asked him, he would have simply said that he was worshipping God, and that by standing on the top of his pillar, he was in some way symbolizing his nearness to God, or getting closer to God.
It says an awful lot, I think, about not only perhaps psychological instability on the part of a guy like Simeon Stylites, but also it says an awful lot about his devotion to Christ and to the Christian faith. That was the way they saw to practice their devotion and to express their fervor.
But the idea that the body and the soul are in conflict manifests itself in different ways. One of Catholicism's greatest saints granted himself every pleasure, yet was torn between his love of the good life and his yearning for a life of the Spirit, a conflict that would make him Catholicism's prime example of the sinner who becomes a saint. At about the same time the Christian hermits were seeking salvation in the desert, the Roman Empire was beginning its slide from greatness. In these chaotic times, a future saint was born. His name was Augustine.
He was born in North Africa. His mother was a Christian. His father may or may not have been a Christian. He was obviously a bright, young, precocious man on the make. He studied rhetoric, and when he was a young man, he went to Rome to seek his fortune.
He was also determined to enjoy himself. In my youth, he later wrote, I burned to get my fill of hellish things. I dared to run wild in the different darksome ways of love. He lived with a woman he never married, had a son, and divided his time between the pleasures of the mind and the pleasures of the flesh. Augustine kept to this path throughout his 20s, and thus, he said, my soul's disease was nourished and kept alive as vigorously as ever.
Even after he decides that there may be a lot of truth in Christianity, Augustine feels incapable of leading a righteous Christian life. I mean, he has that famous prayer in the Confessions in which he says, Lord, make me chaste, but not just yet.
As he approached middle age, Augustine began to suspect he was leading the wrong kind of life for someone who professed to being a Christian. His moral dilemma was reconciling his love for God with his love of worldly pleasures. When he was about 30 years old, he had the experience that changed his life. One day, deep in struggle, the inner conflict that had tortured Augustine for so long became too much to bear. He threw himself on the ground and cried out to God in despair. Then, he thought he heard a child's voice singing. Its words were, "Take up and read, take up and read." Augustine took the voice as a divine command, telling him to find a book of scripture and read the first thing he saw. The words that met his eyes were, "Not in rioting and drunkenness, not in chambering and wantonness, but turn instead to Jesus." This simple act of opening a book at random changed Christianity forever. Augustine became a committed Christian. He converted his son and his friends and gave up every earthly thing he loved.
He separated from this common law wife. In fact, he says in the Confessions that she was ripped from my side. I think he loved this woman very much. Does not mention her name. He is baptized and he goes back to North Africa.
And then he began to write. When the Christians were blamed for Rome's decline, he wrote The City of God, his defense of Christianity. His autobiography, The Confessions, established him as a Christian prototype everyone could identify with. The sinner who, by the grace of God, is redeemed.
There's very little in Christianity that is written by professional theologians after the time of Augustine that somehow doesn't echo Augustine himself. Aquinas in the Middle Ages was terribly indebted to him. Luther not only was indebted to him, but started off as an Augustinian friar following his monastic rule. Augustine's one of the towering figures of the Western Church.
We used to joke about it in college. Augustine had his fun and then repented, and told the rest of us not to have any fun, not to enjoy. We joked about it constantly, but we all read his City of God and, of course, his Confessions. That was mandatory reading. I find him gentle and forgiving, and I don't think we can talk about Catholic intellectual history without introducing Augustine.
Augustine was still at his desk writing as the Vandals swept down through Italy and crossed over into Africa to continue their destruction of what remained of the Roman Empire. He died in the year 430 at the age of 76, just as the young religion called Christianity, and even civilization itself, seemed about to be swept away. When the last Roman emperor was overthrown by the barbarians, some 50 years after Augustine's death, the heart of European civilization almost stopped beating. The one institution that didn't collapse with the empire was the Christian Church. It was the organizing force that kept civilization alive. And the organizing force that helped to keep the Church alive was a simple set of rules conceived by an Italian monk named Benedict. Early in his life, he was a student in Rome, but instead of finishing his education, he went to the mountains and became a hermit. The experience left him with an insight completely contrary to that of devotees like Anthony and Simeon, namely, that denying the body was actually not so desirable, that, in fact, a well-fed, well-rested monk was far more useful to the Church than an emaciated hermit. So Benedict came up with a whole new kind of order for monks. In return for his pledge of poverty, chastity, and obedience, a young man of the time was guaranteed 2 hot meals, a pound of bread, and a half pint of wine a day.
He came up with a brand or a form of monasticism, I think, that really permitted this kind of devotion to spread, to become a universal thing that your average medieval Joe sort of thing could practice and could take part in without having to go and live on a pillar or go off into the desert and live in horrible conditions or roll about in thorns.
But basically what Benedict sees monastic life as being is a kind of a family in which a group of men, or in the case of women, a group of women obviously, would live in community. They call each other brother because they are meant to have a familial relationship. They are under the authority of a father called an abbot. The word Abba, the Aramaic word, does mean father. And they are to lead a life of what he calls prayer and work.
Benedict organized his followers into a community of 12 small monasteries with 10 monks in each. And at some point during this period, he wrote his famous rule, the Code of the Benedictines.
The regula, the rule of Benedict, regularized their lives. It told them how much to eat each day. It told them what garments they could own and what garments they should wear, and when they were worn out, to whom they should be given. It told the monks when they should pray, when they should work. And it set up a living regimen which was, again, fairly easy, fairly comfortable to follow. Most people who joined it didn't find it terribly challenging. And that, again, is really what contributes to the rapid spread of Benedictine monasticism throughout Europe.
The monastery quickly became an oasis of order and safety, surrounded by disorder and insecurity. In these besieged fortresses, the monks worked at their appointed duties and kept the West's spiritual riches alive, its music, art, and learning. Without their efforts, it's entirely possible that Western civilization itself would have perished. For the next 500 years, the way of life set down by Benedict spread to places as distant as England and Ireland, until finally, out of the fragments of the old Roman Empire, the great civilization of the Middle Ages was born. And so was the man who would embody the spirit of that new age, in a small town in northern Italy called Assisi. He was the son of Peter Bernardone, Assisi's cloth merchant and one of the town's wealthiest citizens. His Christian name was John. Francis was his nickname, Frenchy, because he was an admirer of the romantic French troubadours. His main ambition in life was to be either a famous poet or a soldier. He was popular with everybody, a person of unusual courtesy and charity, but not, at first glance, a saint. When he was about 20 years old, Francis had a dream filled with swords and shields and helmets, and decided it was a call to fame on the battlefield. The next day, he left for war. He had barely gotten started when he got sick. At that point, Francis began the spiritual revolution that transformed him from a good man into a saint. Every day thereafter, he prayed at the ruins of a church. One day, a voice came to him and said, "Francis, go and repair my church." Immediately, Francis sold his horse, and then in his enthusiasm, sold some bolts of his father's cloth. When his father demanded to be repaid, Francis took off his fine clothes and threw them at his father's feet. He declared he was now a servant of God and began a new life. His first job was to rebuild the church, one stone at a time. When his task was finished, Francis and a few companions happily took up the rootless lives of friars. It was the beginning of a new kind of religious order, one that released monks from the monastery and turned them out into the world.
You know, G.K. Chesterton, the English writer, has a wonderful phrase. He said, what Benedict stored, Francis scattered. Monasticism in Europe had been traditionally rural, agricultural, settled. The basic idea of Francis was that it should be an agile and mobile group of people devoted to poverty, identification with the poor, and the preaching of the gospel.
Francis was a man who seemed to love just about everything. He had a special fondness for animals, especially birds, who seemed to recognize in Francis a kindred spirit and would flock to him in great numbers, fearlessly. In his day, Francis's behavior was almost unheard of, yet it was not only tolerated, but admired. If he were alive today, it might be a different story.
Yeah, he'd be seen as an eccentric. He'd be seen as a guy who's over the edge, who, and talk to animals, talk to birds. This man was not playing with a full deck.
At a time of complex theological debate, Francis wanted his message to be so simple that even the village idiot could understand it. Stated simply, Francis believed that if you love God and all of God's creatures, He will bless you in ways you can't imagine.
Francis of Assisi could allow creation to sing this canticle of praise, this canticle of creatures, where everything speaks to him of God. The beauty of the sun and the moon and the flowers and the rivers. Everything to him has to trace the imprint, the seal of God. Everything speaks to him, cries out his name, his goodness, and his beauty. And he's able to recognize his presence in everything.
When Francis was about 44 years old, he had the experience that cemented his reputation as one of the holiest men in all of Christendom. On the mountain called La Verna, he had a vision. As he meditated on the meaning of Christ's suffering, a huge winged being, spread out like a cross in the heavens, appeared to him. When Francis awoke, he found that his body had been marked by what we now call stigmata, an inexplicable bleeding from the hands and the feet, corresponding to the wounds Jesus suffered on the cross. As far as we know, he was the first person, and certainly the first saint, to experience stigmata. Not too long afterwards, Francis fell sick and began to go blind. He died at the age of 45, never imagining he was about to become one of the most popular saints of all time.
And it's no surprise that recently, when a major magazine named the most influential people in the past 1,000 years, Francis of Assisi topped the list. He was seen as the model of gentleness, of peacefulness, of feeding the poor, of being nice to animals. He was a walking SPCA, and it was just that way.
But soon, a more sophisticated theology would again come into vogue, thanks to another Italian saint, born the year that Francis died, and in many ways, quite the opposite kind of man. Thomas Aquinas was born into a well-to-do Italian family who were horrified when the young man decided to become a Dominican monk. So his mother decided to kidnap him and lock him up, and tried to get him to change his mind by plying him with every conceivable temptation. One of Thomas's most notable qualities was his intense power of concentration. For 2 years, he managed to resist every enticement put before him, except food. Thomas liked to eat, and gluttony was the sin he feared most. To fill his mind, as well as his body, he memorized most of the Bible. When his family finally gave up trying to change his mind, Thomas returned to the Dominicans and began studying theology. To his fellow students, the young novitiate from Aquino seemed excessively reserved and silent. They gave him a nickname, the Dumb Ox. But his teachers knew better. The lowing of that dumb ox, one wrote, will resound throughout the whole world. For the remainder of his life, Thomas studied, lectured, and wrote, serving God through his scholarship. The amount of work that Thomas produced was extraordinary, probably because he worked incessantly and could dictate to 4 secretaries at once. His writing radiated reason and common sense. Instead of dwelling on the evils of the flesh and the importance of suffering, Thomas believed God wanted people to be happy.
What I love about St. Thomas seems to me to be his humanness as well. And one of the marvelous statements that he makes that I do enjoy quoting is when he says, trust the authority of your own instincts. What he's really saying is that if you are a person who fits together, you can trust yourself.
Following his own advice, Thomas stopped working on his books after experiencing a vision of God that shook him to his core. I cannot go on, he said. After the things that have been revealed to me, the things that I have written seem like only so much straw. He never wrote or dictated another word and died at the age of 50.
Amen.
For men like Francis of Assisi and Thomas Aquinas, the Middle Ages were a time of remarkable freedom. For women, it was a different story. Even in the late Middle Ages, the fate of most women was marriage and a life of drudgery, little personal freedom, endless childbearing.
Women's roles are much more restricted than men's. Everybody has restrictions, but women's roles are more restricted. They can't really go off and be soldiers. Joan of Arc could be an exception, but that's so exception, but it isn't a normal route.
The one area where women could actually break out of the sort of traditional bond of being a married person, having children, etc., was by entering into the religious life.
Catherine of Siena was the daughter of an Italian cloth dyer and the youngest of 24 children. She began having visions when she was 6 years old, and from a very early age was devoted to prayer and penance. At the age of 13, she decided she was going to control her own life in a culture that didn't allow women that option. When her parents pressed her to get married, she flatly refused.
She had no interest in getting married, especially when her sister, who she loved the most, died in childbirth. Now, I don't think that's so amazing for a 13-year-old to decide I will never get married, and especially not to this smelly, filthy dyer that you want me to marry. I'm going to marry God.
Catherine's obsession with the body was so great it would be hard for most people to imagine. She slept on a board with a stone for a pillow and wore a belt of nails around her waist. Imitating the scourging of Christ, she flagellated herself for an hour and a half every day. And she ate almost nothing.
People write poems saying that this is surely the work of the devil, because people who are in league with the devil don't need to eat. They can be fed by the devil through a succubus. And so this must be that she is in league with the devil.
Catherine was a mystic, which is to say she communicated directly with God, bypassing the male-dominated church hierarchy of priests and bishops. And even when the priests ordered her to do something, she didn't always obey.
She was told, do not fast, you may not fast, you must eat. I can't. God told me I shouldn't.
Put yourself in medieval shoes for a moment. Their whole world centered upon God, centered upon the life to come. In this world, there wasn't really much to look forward to. This was a trial, in a sense, and the more trial-like it could become for the individual believer, the better the reward in the next life. So they were doing it to have some kind of direct personal experience of the divine.
When Catherine was 17, she joined the Order of St. Dominic, marrying at last not the butcher or the baker, but Christ, the perfect bridegroom.
You see in paintings all the time the mystical marriage of Catherine, and most of them show an infant that she's married to, and that is not what her own biography describes the experiences. For Catherine of Siena, it's a big grown-up muscular Jesus, really quite a good-looking fellow.
After spending many years in solitude, Catherine began to lead a more active spiritual life, caring for the sick at a time when the Black Plague was resurfacing in Italy. She prepared people for death and buried many with her own hands. By this time, she was subsisting almost entirely on Eucharist wafers. By the time she was in her late 20s, Catherine of Siena was looked upon as a great spiritual figure, and even advised the Pope.
She lived at a terribly tumultuous time in the history of the Church. The papacy was not in Rome. The popes were living in Avignon in southern France. And I think one of the most interesting things about Catherine, who was basically a simple, semi-literate woman, was that she wrote these very strong letters to the popes in Avignon, trying to get them straightened out, telling them that they were in danger of losing their souls if they didn't get back to Rome.
And interestingly, during this period of worldly success, Catherine began to eat real food. But when the Pope died and her influence diminished, she began to starve herself again. Eventually, racked by doubts that she had accomplished anything in her life, she even refused to drink water.
At the very end, she's tormented by doubts that all of this has been for her own aggrandizement and not for the glory of God. And she expresses those doubts, which to me is a wonderful indication of the complexity of a saint. She had a period of great success in the world, but then there is a reversion to this profound concern with the bodily self.
At the end of April in 1380, the woman who helped to redefine the role of women in the church died from a combination of malnutrition and dehydration. She was 33 years old. In 1535, 150 years after Catherine of Siena blazed the trail for women in the Catholic Church, a 20-year-old woman named Teresa entered the Carmelite convent in the Spanish city of Avila. Teresa entered the convent because she was afraid. A recent illness had left her with a disturbing thought. As she explained in her autobiography, I began to fear that if I had died of my illness, I would have gone to hell, and though I could not incline my will to being a nun, I forced myself to embrace it.
She joined a Carmelite house near Avila fairly early in her life, and found the nuns there to be lax, to say the least. They were living the good life. Many, kept hounds, and many had rich clothing and this kind of thing. Certainly not the sort of more ascetic ideal, I think, that the Carmelite order and certainly most monastic orders in general in Europe demanded.
The people of the town were frequent visitors at the convent, and the nuns often left their enclosure to socialize and partake of the fancy foods their visitors brought along. And for 18 years, Teresa enjoyed these relaxed summer afternoons as much as anyone.
Eventually, she went through some kind of a conversion experience. She had her first vision, I believe, when she was a teenager in this convent. She was seen to suddenly at prayer or mass to fall on the chapel floor and roll about. It suggests to me perhaps an epileptic seizure is what it really sounds like, and her descriptions of it in her autobiography are interesting. She talks about losing consciousness, surrendering the self to God, these kinds of things.
One of the people she met during this time was the writer and mystic who called himself John of the Cross. They became close friends and confidants, and forged a relationship uncommon in the Catholic Church even today. Uncommon because she was the leader and he was the follower. Teresa decided that permissiveness and godliness did not go well together, and resolved to reform the Carmelite order.
She broke away from that house and set up her own separate house over which she presided as abbess. And she wrote a directive rule for her followers in which she bade her nuns wear rope sandals. They had to sleep on straw on the floor. Their diets were very restricted. The prayer times were all-encompassing. In fact, it became one of the world's first cloistered orders in that the nuns had to observe a very strict vow of silence as well.
Though Teresa described herself as vain, weak-willed, and fond of comforts, she would insist that the women who joined her order have, above all, intelligence and good judgment. God preserve us, she once said, from stupid nuns.
She said once when she was going to visit a convent where the sisters were reportedly having visions, she said, well, they won't have any visions after I get there, which shows that she had a very real sense of what was important and what was incidental in the life of someone even professing the life of perfection.
Teresa died at the age of 67, and that's when people began to notice a certain wonderful smell. During her lifetime, Teresa had always been enveloped by a delightful fragrance. After her death, it continued to persist in the area around her grave, an overpowering aroma of roses or perhaps gardenias. Eventually, curiosity about the future saint's condition became so widespread that 3 years after her death, permission was granted to exhume her body. According to an eyewitness account, the holy body was as fresh and whole as if it had only been buried the day before. In the end, Teresa was buried and disinterred a number of times, and each time she was dug up, some part of her body was removed to be used as a relic that might work miracles. It has even been reported that Generalissimo Francisco Franco wore one of her fingers as a talisman around his neck. St. Teresa's last disinterment was in 1914, and as always, witnesses reported the same flowery fragrance. At the time of Teresa's death, one of her contemporaries and fellow countrymen was also creating a new Catholic order. His name was Ignatius of Loyola, and his order of scholar missionaries would not only make him a saint, but open every corner of the world to Christianity. He called it the Society of Jesus. Today, we usually refer to its members as Jesuits. At his death in 1556, Ignatius Loyola left behind a 1,000-member organization that had begun converting pagan souls in the New World. In the 16th century, Loyola's Jesuit missionaries fanned out across North, Central, and South America, looking for souls to be saved. It was the kind of work that almost required a complete disregard for the body, because, like the early martyrs, missionaries not only died for the faith, but were frequently tortured for it. For Jean de Brébeuf, in the wilds of eastern Canada, it was always a dangerous task. Because to the Indians, the black-robed strangers seemed like nothing less than sorcerers and witches. In March of 1649, the path to sainthood opened wide for Jean de Brébeuf. The priest and his village of converts were captured by their Iroquois neighbors. The martyrdom he suffered at the hands of his captors was one of the most agonizing in all of Christian history. First, the Jesuit and his companions were forced to run a gauntlet and beaten. Next, they were stripped of their clothes. Their fingers were chewed and their fingernails were torn out. A while later, Father de Brébeuf, still alive, was set on fire. The Iroquois cut off his nose and lips and forced a hot iron down his throat. They poured scalding water over his head, scalped him, cut off his feet, and stripped off his flesh while he was still conscious. Finally, his torturers cut open his chest, removed his heart, and ate it. When he was made a saint, a mere 3 years after his death, Jean de Brébeuf became another link in a chain stretching back to the earliest days of Christianity. Only a few of the men and women who have been canonized can claim the spectacular martyrdom of a Saint Jean de Brébeuf, but almost all of them were just as committed to living their lives according to principles set down 2,000 years ago. Each saint tells a different story. Each of them followed a different road to sainthood. But for all of them, eventually, the life of the Spirit became all-consuming. It is early in the 4th century AD. The Christian persecutions have ended. The age of martyrdom is over. And the first Christian hermits have arrived in the desert. Each has come alone to do one thing: renounce the pleasures of the body for the pleasures of the spirit. It's a struggle that will obsess many a Christian, and they'll do almost anything in their desire to get closer to God. Anthony of Egypt was one of them. Renunciation, Anthony once said, means giving up the ties of this earthly and temporal life. Only when a man is free of all human care can he turn his soul to heavenly things.
The ascetic tradition is not peculiar to Christianity. Every major religion in the world has a kind of an ascetic tradition within it.
The whole idea of asceticism was to deny pleasure, deny really even one's contact with the material world in this life, thereby increasing one's spirituality, getting closer to God somehow, aiming ultimately for glorious and eternal life beyond.
Anthony was 20 years old when he first began devoting himself to a life of poverty and prayer. He lived in the desert alone for 3 years. The Greek word for alone is monos, the origin of the word monk. Anthony was one of the first Christian monks. Like the Jesus whose life he sought to imitate, Anthony was put to the test. His many temptations and trials of the flesh have been chronicled by artists ever since. Anthony once said about his experience, "Solitude in the desert delivers a man from 3 conflicts: hearing, speech, and sight. There is only one conflict left for him, and that is with fornication." Over the years, Anthony attracted increasing numbers of disciples who settled nearby. This was true of many desert hermits. People came to see them and seek their advice. No one knows the exact number, because no one is sure how many of the early saints really existed. St. George, slayer of dragons, was removed from the official calendar when the church determined he was probably a mythical character. The same thing happened to St. Christopher, patron saint of travelers. But most saints were real people, like we are. Like us, they had their own demons to fight. And their stories give us hope, because they usually won those battles.
We've got models for all kinds of things. How to be a good journalist, how to be a good athlete. I think it's very important that people see that real human beings, not angels, not nice stories, real human beings could, through the grace of God, reach a level of holiness sufficient to be called a saint, and we could all aspire to do it.
It shouldn't surprise us that most of the men and women who become saints have been members of the clergy. But just because you're a monk or a nun doesn't mean you can't stand out.
People would come to a particular monk, a particular ascetic, and say, "Father, give me a good word." And then the monk would sort of give that person a piece of advice or tell them something that they needed to know.
So they were looking at new ways of living out the Christian message, new ways of forming a Christian community. And so they placed a great deal of emphasis on not only on asceticism, on self-denial, but also on virtues such as patience and humility, and all the things that Christians valued in their communal living.
By the time Anthony was in his 60s, he had attracted so many admirers that the solitary life he preferred was no longer easy to come by.
And so he went off into the hills and founded the first, what we now consider the first sort of Christian monastery in Egypt in the mid-4th century AD. And each monk lived in a cell by themselves, and yet they formed a kind of a loose community. And it was Anthony who first wrote a rule for their lives.
Despite his strict asceticism, Anthony was said to be a man of much personal warmth and was not considered a fanatic. In the end, he returned, with pleasure, to the reclusive life. He would live to be 105 years old, and when he died would be buried, according to his wishes, in a secret place.
I'm sure that if we were to meet a Desert Father, we might well think there was an element of fanaticism about him, maybe about a lot of them. Possibly some of them were suffering from delusions or diseases like schizophrenia of various kinds. But I think that when one looks at the Desert Fathers as a whole, the prevailing impression one gets is one of wisdom and moderation. The Desert Fathers were very wise teachers. They understood a lot about what it is to be a human being.
Anthony was never formally canonized. As with many of Christianity's early holy men, the people who admired him simply declared him a saint, and his legend grew. Anthony would be followed by people whose methods of liberating the spirit were even more extreme.